$100 million. Cornelius Vanderbilt was richer than almost anyone on earth, but his last will created a curse so powerful that when 120 descendants gathered decades later, not a single one remained wealthy. That document triggered the most dramatic fortune collapse in American history. The lawyer's hands trembled as he unfolded the document. It was January 10th, 1877, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America, had been dead for barely a week. The reading of his will was about to tear a family apart. Around the mahogany table sat the Commodore's children, their faces tight with anticipation. They had watched their father build an empire from nothing, transforming himself from a poor Staten Island farm boy into a titan who controlled America's railroads and shipping lanes. Now they waited to learn how his $100 million fortune would be divided. That sum represented nearly 1/7 of all the money circulating in the United States at the time. The Commodore had been many things: brilliant, ruthless, vulgar, and utterly unforgiving. He had started with a small ferry service at age 16, borrowed $100 from his mother, and turned it into a transportation monopoly that made kings look poor. He crushed competitors without mercy, manipulated stock prices with genius, and built the New York Central Railroad into the backbone of American commerce. Yet despite his astronomical wealth, he lived simply, almost miserly. He wore the same black suit for years, refused to heat his home adequately, and counted every penny with the intensity of a man still struggling to survive. His children had grown up in his shadow, always aware of the fortune, but never quite able to touch it. The Commodore had little patience for weakness, and he viewed most of his offspring as disappointments. His favorite son, George, had died young. Another son had struggled with epilepsy and gambling, earning only his father's contempt and a threat of disinheritance. His daughters had married, as daughters did, and expected little beyond their dowries. That left William Henry Vanderbilt, the eldest surviving son, whom the Commodore had once dismissed as a fool, too slow and too soft for business. William had been sent away to manage a failing Staten Island farm, essentially exiled from the empire. But something remarkable had happened during those years of banishment. William had transformed that struggling property into a profitable enterprise. He learned agriculture, management, and the patient accumulation of success that came from careful attention rather than dramatic gambles. When the Commodore finally brought him back into the railroad business, William proved himself not just competent, but exceptional. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The numbers were staggering, but the distribution was even more so. William Henry Vanderbilt would receive $95 million, nearly the entire fortune. The rest of the children would split $5 million among them, with the bulk of that going to the Commodore's widow. 4 of the Commodore's 8 surviving daughters received virtually nothing beyond their earlier marriage settlements. The silence that followed the reading was profound, heavy with shock and rage. Then came the accusations, the tears, the threats. How could their father have been so cruel? How could he have concentrated so much wealth in the hands of one son? The Commodore's daughters felt betrayed and humiliated. His other sons felt erased, as if their very existence had been deemed worthless by the man whose approval they had spent their lives seeking. But the Commodore's logic, as brutal as it was, held a certain terrible clarity. He had built his fortune through singular vision and iron control. Dividing it equally among his children would fragment the empire, weakening it until competitors tore it apart. By giving virtually everything to William, he kept the business intact and under unified control. It was the decision of a man who loved power and legacy more than he loved his children, who saw his fortune not as a gift to be shared, but as a living entity that needed protection. What the Commodore could not have foreseen, or perhaps did not care about, was the precedent he was setting. He had just demonstrated that Vanderbilt wealth was meant to be concentrated, hoarded, and used to display dominance. The lessons his grandchildren would learn from this moment would shape their approach to money in ways that would ultimately destroy the very legacy he sought to preserve. William Henry Vanderbilt accepted his inheritance with the weight of enormous responsibility. At 56 years old, he suddenly controlled assets equivalent to roughly $200 billion in today's money. He was not a flashy man by nature. Unlike his father, he had a gentle temperament and actually enjoyed family life. But he also understood that managing such wealth required more than just financial acumen. It required managing the family's growing appetite for luxury. The Gilded Age was dawning in America, that peculiar period after the Civil War when industrialization created unprecedented wealth, and those who possessed it felt compelled to display it with almost desperate ostentation. The old American values of thrift and modesty were giving way to something else entirely. A new aristocracy that competed not through titles of nobility, but through the size of their mansions, the extravagance of their parties, and the conspicuousness of their consumption. William's wife, Maria Louisa Kissam Vanderbilt, had social ambitions that far exceeded the Commodore's simple tastes. She wanted the Vanderbilt name to mean something beyond money. She wanted it to represent culture, refinement, and social dominance. And she set about achieving that goal with the same ruthless efficiency her father-in-law had applied to business. The family began building, not just homes, but statements carved in limestone and marble. William himself commissioned a massive mansion on Fifth Avenue, a triple townhouse that took up an entire block. His children would each receive their own palaces. The money that the Commodore had accumulated through decades of careful, often miserly habits was about to be unleashed in a torrent of architectural ambition. William and Maria had 8 children who survived to adulthood, and each would inherit a portion of William's fortune. Among them was George Washington Vanderbilt II, born in 1862, the youngest and perhaps most sensitive of the brood. While his older brothers prepared to enter business and his sisters prepared for strategic marriages, young George was showing signs of being different. He was a quiet child, bookish and thoughtful, more interested in art and literature than in railroad timetables and stock certificates. He spoke multiple languages, collected rare books, and dreamed of European estates with their ancient forests and architectural grandeur. In the rough and tumble world of Gilded Age New York, where fortunes were made and lost over dinner, where business was conducted with the subtlety of a bare-knuckle fight, George seemed almost fragile, a throwback to some gentler era that perhaps had never actually existed. But George had also inherited something else, a fortune so vast that he would never need to work, never need to prove himself in business, never need to do anything but pursue his increasingly elaborate dreams. And unlike his grandfather, who had been forced by poverty to channel his ambitions into practical enterprises, George would have the resources to turn fantasy into reality, regardless of the cost or consequence. The Commodore's will had been read. The fortune was divided, however unevenly. The family that had once struggled together on Staten Island was now one of the wealthiest in the world. They stood at the pinnacle of American success, with all the resources they could ever need to build, create, and establish a dynasty that would last for centuries. They had no idea that the very wealth they celebrated would become their curse, that the freedom it provided would lead to excess, that the lack of restraint would result in spectacular waste, and that within a few generations the name Vanderbilt would be synonymous not just with wealth, but with its loss. The seeds of destruction were already planted in that will, in that concentration of resources, in that freedom from consequence. The tragedy had begun, though no one in that room could see it yet. They saw only the gleaming promise of unlimited possibility, and they reached for it with both hands. George Washington Vanderbilt II grew up surrounded by magnificence, that would have overwhelmed most people, yet he remained curiously untouched by its corrupting influence. Born on November 14, 1862, he entered a world where his family name alone opened every door, where money was never discussed because it was simply assumed, and where the question was never what one could afford, but what one desired. His father William died in 1885 when George was only 23, leaving behind a fortune of $200 million. The bulk went to George's older brothers, Cornelius and William K., who would run the railroad empire. George received $5 million outright, plus income from another $5 million in trust. He had already inherited $1 million from his grandfather and received another $1 million on his 21st birthday. By any measure, he was spectacularly wealthy, yet among Vanderbilts, he was almost the poor relation. But George never showed interest in accumulating more. While his brothers fought over stock prices and railroad routes, George built a personal library that eventually housed over 20,000 volumes. He studied languages with obsessive dedication, becoming fluent in 8 foreign tongues and gaining reading knowledge of Hebrew and Sanskrit. He collected art not for investment, but because beauty moved him. He traveled not to conduct business, but to experience the world's great cultural treasures. Paris became his second home. The Vanderbilts maintained residences there, and George spent months wandering through museums, attending lectures at the Sorbonne, and studying the architectural masterpieces of the Renaissance. He walked through the Loire Valley, sketching the great chateaux, measuring their proportions, understanding how stone and glass could create spaces that lifted the human spirit. The Château de Blois particularly captivated him with its blend of Gothic and Renaissance elements, its way of sitting in the landscape as if it had grown there naturally. His mother Maria doted on him, perhaps because he was her youngest, perhaps because his gentle nature reminded her of William before the weight of fortune had settled on his shoulders. After William's death, George lived with her in the massive Fifth Avenue mansion, content to manage the family's art collection and pursue his scholarly interests. He seemed destined to become one of those cultivated gentlemen who populated the margins of Gilded Age society, admired for their taste, but slightly pitied for their lack of ambition. Then, in 1888, everything changed. George was 26 when he accompanied his mother on a trip to western North Carolina. Asheville was then a small resort town, known for its cool mountain climate and mineral springs that supposedly cured various ailments. Wealthy Northerners had begun discovering it as a refuge from summer heat and winter illness. George stepped off the train and into a revelation. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose around Asheville in endless waves of green and blue, their peaks shrouded in mist that gave them an almost mystical quality. The air was different here, crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine and wild rhododendron. The light had a particular clarity, making distant ridges stand out with startling definition. This was wilderness, but wilderness that could be shaped, that called out for human imagination to complete its beauty. He rode through the countryside south of town, studying the land with the eye of someone who had spent years examining European estates. Here was space on a scale that France could never offer. Here was terrain that could accommodate a true country estate, not the cramped imitations of Newport or Long Island. Here, he realized, he could build something that America had never seen. A working estate that combined European grandeur with American scale, that proved the New World could create beauty to rival anything the Old World had produced. Within months, George began purchasing land through his lawyer Charles McNamee. The transactions were conducted with such secrecy that local newspapers filled with speculation. Who was this mysterious northern capitalist buying up thousands of acres? What did he intend to do with it? Some feared he would strip the forests for timber. Others worried he would fence off land that locals had used for generations. The land purchases continued through 1889 and beyond. 3,000 acres became 6,000, then 10,000, eventually reaching 125,000 acres of mountains, valleys, and forests. It was an area larger than many European principalities, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars just to acquire. George had found his purpose. He would create an estate that embodied everything he had learned from his travels, everything he believed about the relationship between humans and nature, everything he dreamed architecture could achieve. It would be called Biltmore, combining Bilt, the Dutch town from which his ancestors had emigrated, with moor, an Old English word for rolling upland countryside. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, America's foremost architect, who had designed mansions for his brothers and other Vanderbilt relatives. He engaged Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had created Central Park, to design the grounds. These were not merely the best professionals money could hire. They were artists who shared George's vision of creating something extraordinary, something that would stand for centuries as proof that American wealth could produce lasting beauty rather than merely temporary ostentation. Construction began in 1889. George was 27 years old, unmarried, with unlimited resources and an ambition that would consume the next 6 years of his life and millions of dollars of his fortune. He had no way of knowing that this magnificent obsession would also set in motion the forces that would eventually bring his family to ruin. But in that moment, standing on a hillside overlooking the French Broad River, with architectural plans spread before him and the mountains rising in every direction, George Vanderbilt saw only possibility. The dream was taking shape, and it was going to be glorious. On a hillside south of Asheville, the sound of hammers and saws echoed through the mountains. It was 1889, and George Vanderbilt's dream was taking physical form. What began as sketches and architectural models in Richard Morris Hunt's New York office was now becoming the largest private residence America would ever see. The scale of the operation was staggering. George wasn't just building a house, he was creating an entire industrial complex to support its construction. A brick kiln rose on the property, churning out 32,000 bricks each day. A woodworking factory took shape nearby, where craftsmen turned raw timber into the intricate paneling and moldings the house would require. Most remarkably, George paid $50,000 to construct a 3-mile railroad spur connecting the construction site directly to the Asheville depot. Trainloads of Indiana limestone, Italian marble, and materials from across the globe began arriving with mechanical regularity. 1,000 workers flooded into the area, transforming the quiet mountain landscape into a bustling construction site. Among them were 60 master stonemasons, many brought over from Europe specifically for this project. These craftsmen shaped each block of limestone by hand, their chisels creating the intricate details that would give Biltmore its European character. The sound of stone meeting steel became the constant background music of the valley. Hunt's design drew heavily from the French chateau he and George had toured. The facade stretched 375 feet across, featuring steeply pitched roofs, turrets, and sculptural ornamentation that would have looked perfectly at home in the Loire Valley. Yet this was no mere copy. Hunt carefully positioned the 4-story structure to fit harmoniously into the mountainous terrain, ensuring it complemented rather than dominated the landscape. The building would contain 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space, including 35 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms. The banquet hall alone represented an achievement in engineering and artistry. Its ceiling soared 70 feet overhead, higher than many cathedrals. A massive triple fireplace dominated one wall, large enough that a grown man could stand inside without stooping. The room was designed to host hundreds of guests in a space that captured the grandeur of medieval European great halls while incorporating modern conveniences that those ancient builders could never have imagined. Because Biltmore was being built in the 1890s, it would include technological marvels that set it apart from its European inspirations. Electric lighting would illuminate every room. Central heating would flow through miles of pipes. An Otis elevator would carry guests between floors. There would be indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, a luxury that many urban homes still lacked. A heated indoor swimming pool, refrigeration systems, and even early fire prevention technology would all be integrated into the design. Frederick Law Olmsted, meanwhile, was reshaping the landscape on a scale that matched the house itself. He had made his reputation designing Central Park in New York, but Biltmore gave him canvas beyond anything he'd attempted before. He planned formal gardens directly around the mansion, including a Roman garden, a conservatory with individual rooms for different plant species, and terraced areas for the European sculptures George had collected. Beyond the formal gardens, Olmsted envisioned thousands of acres of scientifically managed forest, an approach to land stewardship that was virtually unknown in America at the time. The approach road to the house became an artwork in itself. Olmsted designed a winding 4-mile drive that began at an arched gate lodge in Biltmore Village and culminated at sphinx-topped stone pillars marking the estate's entrance. The route was carefully planned to gradually reveal the mansion's grandeur, each turn offering new perspectives of the mountains and forests before the chateau itself finally came into view. Construction consumed George's attention completely. He made frequent trips to the site, examining every detail, consulting with Hunt and Olmsted, making decisions about materials and designs. When he wasn't in Asheville, he traveled overseas, purchasing the furnishings that would fill his massive home. He bought 15th century tapestries, Renaissance paintings, rare books, Oriental rugs, and furniture that had once graced European palaces. These weren't just decorations. They were pieces of history that George believed would give his new estate the patina of age and culture. The costs mounted relentlessly. Contemporary accounts suggested the construction alone consumed approximately $6 million, though some estimates ran even higher. In an era when skilled laborers earned perhaps $2 per day, when a substantial house in a good neighborhood might cost $10,000, George was spending amounts that defied comprehension. That $6 million would be equivalent to roughly $200 million today. But even that comparison fails to capture the true extravagance. He was building not just the largest house, but one of the most expensive structures in American history. Yet George never hesitated, never questioned whether he should scale back his vision. He had the wealth, he had the dream, and he had the determination to see it realized exactly as he imagined it. The workmen toiled through all seasons, the materials continued arriving, and slowly, impossibly, a French Renaissance chateau rose in the north, Carolina Mountains. By 1894, the towers were complete, the roof trusses were in place, the interior spaces were taking shape. The dream that had begun on a hillside 5 years earlier was becoming reality, stone by stone, room by room. In one more year, George would open the doors and show the world what American wealth could create when freed from all constraint. Christmas Eve 1895 arrived with a magical quality. Fresh snow dusted the Blue Ridge Mountains as a special train pulled into Asheville, carrying 27 members of the Vanderbilt family. George stood waiting at the base of the hill, his face betraying both pride and nervousness. After 6 years of construction and millions of dollars spent, Biltmore was about to receive its first guests. The banquet hall had been transformed for the occasion. A 40-foot spruce tree soared toward the 70-foot ceiling, decorated with candles and ornaments that caught the light from the newly installed electric bulbs. Evergreen garlands draped across the massive triple fireplace. The polished limestone walls glowed warm in the candlelight, and the scent of pine mixed with wood smoke filled the air. That evening, the family gathered beneath the towering tree while the imperial trio played music that echoed through the vast space. George's mother, Maria, now 70 years old, stood at the center of the celebration, seeing her youngest son's dream finally realized. His brothers and sisters wandered through the rooms in wonder, taking in the tapestries from 16th century Europe, the paintings by Renoir and Whistler, the furniture that had once belonged to Napoleon during his exile. The next morning brought a different celebration. At 11 o'clock, George opened the banquet hall to the estate's employees and their families, over 200 people in all. Children's eyes grew wide at the sight of the magnificent tree as George and his family distributed gifts. Each servant received an envelope containing $10, a significant sum in 1895. Later, a feast was served in the carriage house, George's way of showing appreciation to those whose labor had made his vision reality. Despite the celebration, Biltmore remained unfinished. The music room stood empty, awaiting completion. Secondary staircases were still under construction. Workers had memorialized the ongoing work by inscribing December 18, 1895, in fresh plaster on the dome above the grand staircase, capturing the rush to prepare for the Christmas opening. Over the following days, close friends arrived from New York. William Osgood Field wrote to his mother describing his arrival after dark. The house, illuminated in moonlight, created a scene more beautiful than any stage effect he had witnessed. The guests enjoyed horseback riding through the estate, hunting expeditions, and simply marveling at what George had created. For George, however, something was missing. At 33, he was America's most eligible bachelor, hosting elaborate gatherings in a palace designed for family life, yet he had no one to share it with. He threw himself into managing the estate, working with Frederick Law Olmsted on the landscaping, overseeing the scientific forestry program on his vast acreage, and continuing to purchase art and rare books for his collection. Then, in 1897, at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebration in London, George met Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She was 10 years younger, descended from Peter Stuyvesant, the first Dutch governor of New York. Edith was friends with George's sister and several nieces, part of the same social circle, but someone he'd never truly noticed before. Tall, cultured, and possessing what friends described as a cheerful energy. She captured George's attention in ways that surprised even him. Their courtship unfolded across Europe, in opera boxes and Parisian bookshops, on ship decks crossing the Atlantic. George, who had always been reserved and bookish, found himself writing romantic letters and making plans that had nothing to do with architecture or forestry. On April 28, 1898, he proposed. The newspapers crowned him Cupid's richest captive. Everyone had assumed George would remain a bachelor, devoted only to his estate and his collections. The announcement became front-page news across America. The wedding took place in Paris on June 1st and 2nd, 1898, following French law that required both a civil and religious ceremony. George and Edith kept it as privat as possible for a Vanderbilt wedding, with only close friends and family attending. Edith wore an understated Empire-style gown in creamy white satin with a court train trimmed in lace that her grandmother had worn nearly a century before. After a 4-month honeymoon exploring Italy's Lake District and visiting museums and galleries, George brought his bride home to Biltmore in October 1898. Estate employees lined the approach road to welcome their new mistress, creating a giant horseshoe from goldenrod flowers with the phrase, "Welcome home." Edith transformed Biltmore from a magnificent showpiece into a true home. She brought warmth and laughter to rooms that had felt almost too perfect. Unlike George, who could be reserved with strangers, Edith engaged easily with the estate workers and their families. She visited when babies were born, bringing gifts and supplies. When families faced illness, she delivered medicine and food. The workers who had built Biltmore for a wealthy bachelor found themselves genuinely caring for the compassionate woman who now managed the household. On August 22, 1900, their daughter Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born in the Louis XV room of Biltmore House. The Spartanburg Journal captured the moment's significance, writing that a new star had appeared at famous Biltmore, and the world shared in the happiness. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect. George had his estate, his wife, and now his daughter. Biltmore operated as he had envisioned. A working agricultural estate, a center for scientific forestry, a home filled with art and culture, and a place where family and friends could gather. He continued expanding the library, now containing over 20,000 volumes. He supported community programs and established educational opportunities for local residents. The estate required enormous resources to maintain. Dozens of servants kept the house running. The grounds needed constant attention. The farming operations and forestry programs consumed significant capital. But George's fortune seemed inexhaustible, and he never hesitated to spend what was necessary to keep Biltmore operating exactly as he imagined it should. These golden years would prove tragically brief. George had created something magnificent, but he had also created something that would consume resources faster than any fortune could sustain. The clock was already ticking on Biltmore's glory days, though no one at the estate could hear it yet over the sound of dinner parties and children's laughter echoing through the grand rooms. Late February 1914 found George Vanderbilt in Washington, preparing for what should have been a routine trip back to Biltmore. At 51, he remained active in managing his estate, overseeing the forestry programs he had pioneered, and enjoying the life he had built with Edith and their 13-year-old daughter, Cornelia. The family maintained a residence in Washington for Cornelia's education, dividing their time between the capital and their mountain retreat. Then came the stomach pains. What began as discomfort quickly escalated into something more serious. Doctors diagnosed appendicitis and recommended immediate surgery. In 1914, appendectomies were no longer the death sentences they had once been, but they remained serious procedures with real risks. George underwent the operation at his Washington home, and initially everything seemed to proceed as expected. Back at Biltmore, Edith received regular telegrams updating her on George's condition. The early messages were encouraging. The surgery had gone well. George was resting comfortably. Doctors expected a full recovery. There seemed no reason for alarm, no indication that anything was wrong. The family allowed themselves to relax, to believe the danger had passed. On March 6, 1914, approximately 10 days after the surgery, George Washington Vanderbilt died suddenly from a pulmonary embolus, a blood clot that had traveled to his lungs. Medical staff surrounded him, but Edith and Cornelia were not there when he took his last breath. The news traveled by telegram to Biltmore, then rippled outward to newspapers across the country. The shock was profound. George had been relatively young, seemingly healthy aside from the appendicitis. He had decades of life ahead of him, plans for the estate, dreams for his daughter's future. Instead, his body was transported to New York for burial in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum at Moravian Cemetery in New Dorp, Staten Island, the same place where his grandfather, the Commodore, rested. Asheville mourned. Many local workers relied on Biltmore for jobs, and George had been known for his generosity and fair treatment of employees. The newspapers celebrated him as a pioneer in forestry conservation, a man who had used his wealth to create something lasting rather than merely consuming it on parties and yachts. But beyond the grief lay a practical crisis of staggering proportions. George's will left the Biltmore estate to his 13-year-old daughter Cornelia, along with $5 million to be held in trust until she turned 25. Edith inherited the Washington house and other properties, but more importantly, she inherited responsibility for managing an estate that consumed resources at an almost incomprehensible rate. Biltmore required approximately 80 servants to operate properly. The grounds needed constant maintenance. The farming operations, the dairy, the forestry programs all demanded ongoing investment. The property taxes alone were substantial. George had been spending more than his annual income on the estate for years, slowly drawing down his capital to maintain his vision of what Biltmore should be. Edith was 41 years old, a widow with a teenage daughter and an architectural monument that threatened to crush them both under its weight. She had always been involved in estate management, But now every decision fell solely on her shoulders. And she was smart enough to recognize that something had to change immediately. George had actually been trying to sell portions of the estate even before his death. The panic of 1907 had frightened him enough that he'd instructed his forestry director to find buyers for parts of the Pisgah forest. Those efforts had largely failed. In 1913, he'd offered 80,000 acres to the federal government, but they'd declined the purchase. Now, barely a month after George's death, Edith renewed that offer with a crucial difference. On May 1, 1914, she wrote to the Secretary of Agriculture offering to sell 86,700 acres at $5 per acre, $2 less than George had offered the previous year. She was taking $200,000 less than the original asking price, sacrificing profit to ensure the sale went through quickly. Her letter emphasized George's conservation vision. She wrote of his firm conviction that forest owners owed it to future generations to hand down their properties unimpaired by wasteful use. She expressed her earnest hope that through public ownership, she could help perpetuate his pioneer work in forest conservation and ensure the protection and enjoyment of the Pisgah forest by the American people for all time. The government accepted within weeks. By May 1915, approximately 86,700 acres of the estate's forested mountain land became Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests east of the Mississippi River. The sale brought in $433,000, desperately needed cash, but it also reduced Biltmore from 125,000 acres to approximately 8,000. Edith had made a pragmatic decision that honored George's legacy while acknowledging reality. She couldn't maintain that much land. The property taxes and management costs would have bankrupted them within years. By selling to the government, she preserved the forest under scientific management principles that George had championed while freeing herself from an impossible financial burden. But 8,000 acres was still an enormous property. The house alone, with its huge space and endless maintenance needs, consumed enormous resources. The formal gardens required constant attention. The remaining farms and dairy operations needed management and investment. And unlike European estates with centuries of accumulated wealth and established agricultural income, Biltmore was barely 20 years old, still burning through capital to establish itself. Edith continued selling land as finances demanded. Parcels went to developers. The Biltmore Forest School, which George had supported as part of his conservation mission, closed permanently. The vision of Biltmore as a completely self-sustaining estate was revealed as the expensive fantasy it had always been. Farms and forests simply couldn't generate enough income to support a palace. The Commodore's curse was manifesting exactly as he might have predicted. His grandson had inherited enough wealth to indulge any dream, and he'd built something magnificent. But magnificence without the harsh discipline of business, without the constant pressure to generate profit, had produced a monument that consumed fortunes rather than creating them. George was gone, leaving behind a widow, a teenage daughter, and America's largest home. The golden years had ended abruptly. What came next would be survival, compromise, and the slow recognition that even Vanderbilt wealth had limits. Cornelia Vanderbilt came of age during the Roaring Twenties, and on April 29, 1924, Biltmore hosted its first wedding ceremony. 500 guests packed into All Souls Church, while another 2,500 received invitations to the reception. Cornelia, at 23, married the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat 10 years her senior who served as first secretary at the British Embassy in Washington. The ceremony united not just two people, but two countries, with American and British flags crossed in the entrance hall, and both national anthems played during the reception. The young couple turned toward their respective flags as the music played, a symbolic gesture that newspapers celebrated as a perfect union of old world aristocracy and new world wealth. John Cecil resigned his diplomatic position to help manage Biltmore, but the marriage brought more financial strain than relief. The estate still required enormous resources to operate. Edith continued making difficult decisions, selling more land parcels to developers, closing programs that George had cherished. The Biltmore Forest School shut down permanently. The vision of a self-sustaining estate was proving impossible to maintain. Cornelia herself struggled with the expectations placed upon her. She had inherited $2 million annually at age 21 and would receive the principal sum of $50 million at 25. Yet she seemed increasingly restless with life at Biltmore. The estate that had been her entire world as a child now felt confining. She had traveled extensively with her parents before her father's death, experiencing Paris, London, and other cosmopolitan centers. Asheville, by comparison, seemed provincial. The couple had two sons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1925, and William Amherst. Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1928. But motherhood didn't settle Cornelia's restlessness. She began spending more time away from Biltmore, visiting New York and other cities, leaving John to manage the estate operations. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed, wiping out 40% of paper values in days. What had seemed like an era of endless prosperity evaporated almost overnight. By 1932, stock values had fallen to less than 1/5 of their 1929 peak. The Vanderbilt fortune, which had once seemed inexhaustible, was suddenly vulnerable. The family's wealth had been tied up in stocks and investments that were now worth a fraction of their former value. Biltmore's operating costs remained the same, but the resources to support them were vanishing. The estate that had consumed millions during construction now threatened to consume what remained of the family fortune during the Depression. Other Vanderbilts faced similar crises. The magnificent Fifth Avenue mansions that George's siblings had built were becoming impossible to maintain. Property taxes, servant salaries, heating costs for buildings designed for an age of cheap coal and cheaper labor were all crushing the family members one by one. Some would eventually demolish their palatial homes rather than continue paying for their upkeep. At Biltmore, Edith faced impossible choices. She couldn't sell the house. It was too unique, too enormous, too expensive to operate for any potential buyer. She couldn't abandon it. It was Cornelia's inheritance, George's legacy. Yet keeping it running during the Depression, when every dollar mattered, seemed increasingly like throwing money into a bottomless pit. The estate staff was reduced. Maintenance projects were delayed. Parts of the house were simply closed off to save on heating. The gardens, once maintained to perfection, began showing signs of neglect. The dairy operations and remaining farms struggled as agricultural prices collapsed nationwide. Cornelia, watching her inheritance crumble, grew more dissatisfied. Her marriage to John was deteriorating. The estate that was supposed to be her birthright had become her burden. The Roaring Twenties had ended with a crash that echoed through every corner of American life, but nowhere more painfully than in the homes of those who had built monuments to wealth during better times. Around 1932, Cornelia found life at Biltmore too dull and made a decision that would shock everyone who knew her. She moved to New York City to study art, leaving John to manage the crumbling estate alone. It was supposed to be temporary, just a brief escape from the pressures of Biltmore. But Cornelia never came back. She moved to Greenwich Village, adopted the name Nilcha based on numerological calculations, and dyed her hair bright pink. The newspapers that had once covered her fairy tale wedding now wrote about the eccentric heiress who had abandoned her duties. In 1934, she divorced John and moved to Paris, then London, severing her connection to Biltmore completely. She took her two young sons, George and William, with her to Europe for their education. John Cecil remained at Biltmore, living in the bachelor's wing, managing an estate that was hemorrhaging money. The man who had left a diplomatic career to marry into the Vanderbilt family now found himself caretaker of a monument he couldn't afford to maintain. The irony was brutal. Without Cornelia's presence or interest, Biltmore began its long decline. The house had opened to the public in March 1930 at the urging of Asheville city officials desperate to boost tourism during the Depression. The house did not receive many visitors during these years, and admission fees of $2 couldn't begin to cover the massive operating costs. The formal gardens that Olmsted had so carefully designed grew wild in places. Maintenance on the house was deferred year after year. Roofs leaked, plaster cracked. The heating system, never efficient, became increasingly unreliable. Parts of the mansion were simply closed off to save money, their furniture covered in sheets, their windows shuttered against the weather. When World War II began, Biltmore closed from 1941 to 1945. The house found a new, temporary purpose when 62 paintings and 17 sculptures were moved to the estate by train from the National Gallery of Art in Washington for safekeeping. Works by Rembrandt, Raphael, and Gilbert Stuart's famous portrait of George Washington rested in the music room, which had never been finished and served as storage. The greatest art in America was protected at Biltmore, while the house itself continued deteriorating. The dairy operation, which had once been George's pride, remained profitable and kept the estate from complete financial collapse. But a dairy farm couldn't support a palace. John Cecil struggled on through the war years, managing what he could, watching the house sink deeper into disrepair. Edith, George's widow, had remarried Senator Peter Gerry in 1925 and moved away from Biltmore. She returned occasionally, but had her own life in Washington. The house that had been built for family gatherings, for generations of Vanderbilts to enjoy, stood nearly empty. Only John Cecil remained, a caretaker in rooms designed for grand entertainments, eating alone in a dining room built to seat 64 guests. The contrast with the golden years couldn't have been starker. Where once dozens of servants had maintained every detail to perfection, now a skeleton staff struggled to keep essential systems working. Where carriages had lined the drive bringing wealthy visitors, now only an occasional tourist car appeared. Where laughter and music had filled the halls, now there was mostly silence broken only by the wind through improperly sealed windows and the occasional drip from leaking ceilings. Biltmore had become exactly what critics had predicted when George built it. A magnificent folly, beautiful and utterly impractical, consuming resources without producing anything of value. The Vanderbilt dream of a self-sustaining estate had been revealed as fantasy. No amount of careful forestry or agricultural planning could generate enough income to support the mansion of French Renaissance architecture perched in the North Carolina mountains. The house wasn't just declining physically, it was becoming irrelevant. The world had moved on. The Gilded Age values that had produced Biltmore had been replaced by Depression-era practicality and wartime austerity. Nobody was building palaces anymore. The few that existed were being demolished or converted to other uses. The Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue were coming down one by one, too expensive to maintain, too impractical for modern life. Cornelia never returned to see what her abandonment had wrought. She lived in London, married again, and seemingly put her entire American life behind her. The estate that her father had poured his heart and fortune into creating, the house where she had been born and raised, meant nothing to her anymore. She had walked away and never looked back. The Vanderbilt story represents one of the most spectacular financial collapses in American history. Less than 30 years after Cornelius Vanderbilt's death in 1877, the family had fallen off the list of the wealthiest families in the United States. The decline accelerated with stunning speed. In 1973, when 120 Vanderbilts gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University, there wasn't a single millionaire in attendance. How does a fortune estimated at over $200 billion in today's money simply vanish? The answer lies in a perfect storm of poor financial management, lavish spending, and fundamental misunderstanding of wealth preservation. The Commodore had failed to establish trusts or legal structures to protect the wealth for future generations. Unlike other wealthy families of his era, who created sophisticated estate plans with mandatory wealth preservation mechanisms, Cornelius simply handed his fortune to William and expected it to continue growing. William doubled it, but then made the critical error of dividing it among his sons without any protective structures. George's siblings were no better at preserving wealth than George himself had been. Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandson Reggie racked up enormous debt through his extravagant lifestyle and had to sell off possessions. His brothers built competing mansions along Fifth Avenue, each trying to outdo the others in size and opulence. They maintained multiple estates, employed hundreds of servants, hosted parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and purchased art collections worth millions. The third and fourth generations had grown up never needing to work, never learning to manage money, and never understanding that even vast fortunes have limits. They assumed the money would always be there, that they could spend freely without consequence. They indulged in luxurious residence, extravagant parties, and lavish hobbies without any planning for wealth preservation. The introduction of modern income and estate taxes in the early 20th century devastated the family further. Previously, the Vanderbilts had operated in an era of virtually no taxation. Suddenly, large portions of estates were being claimed by the government with each generation's inheritance. The expensive lifestyles became harder to fund as tax burdens mounted. Cornelius had concentrated nearly all his wealth in railroad and shipping stocks, failing to diversify across industries or invest in hard assets like real estate. When railroad travel began declining and the transportation industries faced disruption, the foundation of Vanderbilt wealth crumbled. Later generations couldn't simply live off dividends when those dividends were shrinking. The Great Depression accelerated the collapse. Stock values plummeted. The massive estates became impossible to maintain. One by one, the Fifth Avenue palaces were demolished rather than continue paying their crushing operating costs and property taxes. The Newport cottages that had cost millions to build were donated to preservation societies because nobody could afford to keep them. George's brothers sold everything they could. Cornelius II's descendants struggled to maintain even modest lifestyles. The railroad empire that had made them wealthy eventually went bankrupt. The shipping lines disappeared. The investments that should have sustained generations evaporated. By mid-century, being a Vanderbilt meant something very different than it had 50 years earlier. The name still carried historical weight, but the fortune was gone. Descendants had to work for their livings, just like everyone else. Some succeeded on their own merits. Gloria Vanderbilt built a fashion empire in the 1970s. Her son Anderson Cooper became a successful broadcaster, though he acknowledged there was no trust fund waiting for him. The Commodore had once been richer than the United States Treasury. Within 4 generations, his descendants were attending family reunions where nobody present could claim millionaire status. It was a fall so complete, so total, that it became a cautionary tale studied in business schools and by wealth managers worldwide. What the Commodore had built through ruthless business acumen, his descendants had squandered through careless spending and poor planning. The empire that had seemed eternal proved shockingly fragile. The wealth that appeared inexhaustible was finite after all. And Biltmore, George's magnificent monument to Vanderbilt greatness, stood as the last physical reminder of what the family had once been and everything they had lost. In 1960, a young banker named William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil made a decision that would either save his family's legacy or become its final embarrassment. He was 32 years old, working at Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, when he received an urgent call about Biltmore. The estate was losing $250,000 annually. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. William flew to Asheville and confronted the reality his family had been avoiding for decades. The house desperately needed repairs that nobody could afford. Furnishings that had once impressed European royalty were deteriorating from neglect. The heating system barely functioned. Parts of the roof leaked. The gardens showed signs of abandonment. This wasn't just a house in decline. It was a monument on the verge of collapse. His older brother George had already claimed the dairy operations, the only consistently profitable part of the estate. That left William with the house itself and the seemingly impossible task of making it financially viable. Most preservation experts insisted it couldn't be done. A house this size, this old, this expensive to maintain, could never generate enough revenue to sustain itself. They predicted he would fail within 5 years. The criticism came from all directions. Preservationists argued that commercializing a historic home would destroy its authenticity. The Vanderbilt name would be cheapened, turned into a tourist trap, reduced to something common and vulgar. George Vanderbilt had built Biltmore as a retreat from commerce, and now his grandson wanted to turn it into a business? It seemed like a betrayal of everything the estate represented. William ignored every objection. He understood something the critics didn't. Preservation required money, and money required profit. He developed a philosophy that would guide every decision he made. We don't preserve Biltmore to make a profit. We make a profit to preserve Biltmore. It was a simple reversal of priorities, but it would prove revolutionary. He started with basics that seemed almost insultingly simple. The estate had been open to visitors since 1930, but nobody was marketing it effectively. William began running advertisements in regional newspapers. He improved the visitor experience, training guides to tell compelling stories rather than just reciting facts. He studied which rooms generated the most interest and gradually opened more areas to tours. In the early 1960s, admission cost $2.50, and visitors saw only the ground floor, gardens, and dairy barn. Large sections of the house remained closed, not because they were being preserved, but because nobody had figured out how to incorporate them into the tour. William began systematically restoring these forgotten spaces and adding them to the visitor experience. He took on roles that would have horrified his great-great-grandfather. William served as manager, promoter, and on busy days, he even sold tickets himself. There was no task too small, no job beneath him. He understood that saving Biltmore required total commitment, not aristocratic detachment. Progress came with agonizing slowness. Every improvement required capital the estate didn't have. Every restoration project had to be justified by projected revenue increases. William was essentially running a startup business, except his product was a 70-year-old house that consumed money faster than it could generate it. In 1968, 8 years after William took control, Biltmore finally turned a profit. The amount was $16.24. It was nothing, barely enough to buy lunch, completely insignificant in accounting terms. But it was positive. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the estate had made more money than it spent. The trajectory had finally changed. That tiny profit proved William's concept. If the estate could break even, it could eventually thrive. He just needed to scale the operation, attract more visitors, create additional revenue streams. The challenge was doing all of this while maintaining the historic character that made Biltmore special in the first place. In 1979, William and his brother formally divided the estate properties. George retained the dairy operations and surrounding land, which he would develop into Biltmore Forest, a planned residential community. William kept the house, gardens, and core acreage. This separation allowed each brother to focus entirely on their respective businesses without conflicts over resources or priorities. Then came William's most controversial decision. In 1985, he announced plans to open a winery in the former dairy barn. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Critics called it a desperate gimmick. A successful winery in North Carolina? Impossible. Wine production belonged in California and Europe, not the southern Appalachians. The climate was wrong, the soil was questionable, and nobody would take a North Carolina wine seriously. William traveled to France and recruited Philippe Jourdain, a sixth-generation winemaker from a respected French wine family. Jourdain saw potential in the estate's microclimate and soil composition. He believed they could produce quality wines, but it would require significant investment and patience. There would be no quick profits. The winery opened despite continued skepticism. The first years were challenging, with production limited and critics ready to declare failure. But gradually, something remarkable happened. The wines improved. Visitors discovered they enjoyed tasting wine in the elegant former dairy barn. The winery became not just an attraction, but a destination in itself. William continued adding carefully planned attractions. He built the Inn on Biltmore Estate, a luxury hotel that allowed visitors to experience the property overnight rather than just for a few hours. He developed Antler Hill Village with restaurants and shops that showcased regional crafts and foods. He created an equestrian center that honored George Vanderbilt's love of horses and countryside pursuits. Each addition was scrutinized. Would it enhance the estate or detract from it? Would it attract the right kind of visitor or turn Biltmore into a theme park? William walked a constant tightrope between commercial necessity and historic preservation. Every decision served the mission of generating revenue while respecting the property's heritage. The transformation took decades, not years. There were setbacks, seasons when visitor numbers disappointed, investments that didn't pay off as quickly as projected. But William persisted. He had committed to saving Biltmore, and he refused to abandon that commitment even when the path forward seemed unclear. In 1963, Biltmore received designation as a National Historic Landmark, acknowledging its architectural and cultural significance. This recognition validated William's approach. He wasn't destroying history through commercialization, he was preserving it through intelligent business management. By 1995, when William retired at age 67, the transformation was complete. Annual revenues had reached $32 million. The estate had become North Carolina's most popular tourist attraction and Asheville's largest private employer. More importantly, Biltmore was financially secure for the first time since George built it a century earlier. That same year, William received the National Trust Preservation Award for his unique achievement in restoration and economically viable administration. The man who had once been criticized for commercializing history was now celebrated for saving it. He had proven that historic preservation and commercial success weren't mutually exclusive. He had demonstrated that treating a historic property as a business didn't cheapen it, but rather ensured its survival. William handed control to his children with the estate on solid footing. The winery was thriving, producing thousands of cases annually. The hotel was fully booked most weekends. The attractions he had added were drawing visitors from across the country. The house that had nearly bankrupted multiple generations was finally self-sustaining. The irony of William's achievement was profound and impossible to ignore. George Vanderbilt had built Biltmore as an escape from the commercial world his grandfather had dominated. He wanted a place where beauty and culture mattered more than profit, where European refinement could flourish away from American business vulgarity. He deliberately created an estate that made no economic sense, that existed purely for aesthetic and cultural purposes. His great-grandson saved that dream by doing exactly what George had refused to do, putting profit first. William embraced the business principles that George had rejected. He commercialized the very spaces George had kept private. He turned the family sanctuary into a public attraction. He transformed art into inventory and architecture into product. Yet in doing so, William preserved what George had created. The house stood, the collections remained intact, the gardens continued flourishing. Future generations would see George's vision not because it was kept pure, but because it was adapted to survive. Biltmore remained the only Vanderbilt mansion still in family hands. The Fifth Avenue palaces were gone, demolished in the 1920s and 30s. The Newport cottages belonged to preservation societies. The various estates scattered across Long Island and elsewhere had been subdivided or destroyed. Only Biltmore survived, and it survived because someone finally treated it like a business instead of a shrine. William Cecil proved that even spectacular mistakes can be corrected if someone is willing to make difficult, unpopular decisions. He showed that legacy means nothing if it can't sustain itself. He demonstrated that the greatest respect for the past sometimes means radically reimagining its future. When William retired in 1995, he left behind more than a successful business. He left behind a model for how historic properties could survive in the modern world. He proved that commercialization and preservation could coexist, that profit and beauty weren't enemies, but allies. The estate that had consumed fortunes was finally generating them. The house that had threatened to destroy a family was now supporting one. The monument that had seemed destined to become a ruin was instead becoming a testament to the power of practical thinking over romantic idealism. George Vanderbilt had dreamed of creating something that would last for centuries. His grandson William ensured that dream would survive by being willing to change everything except the dream itself. Today, Bill Cecil Jr. walks the same halls his great-great-grandfather built, but he's not living off inherited wealth. He's working. As CEO of the Biltmore Company, he manages over 2,000 employees and oversees operations that generate hundreds of millions annually. His sister Deanie chairs the board. Their children are already learning the business. This is what survival looks like for American aristocracy. The Vanderbilts who built palaces are gone. The ones who remain punch-time cards. The Commodore once controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury. 4 generations later, his family held a reunion where not one person qualified as a millionaire. Other dynasties learned from this spectacular collapse. The Rockefellers built trusts. The Carnegies created foundations. They watched the Vanderbilts squander everything and chose differently. But Biltmore stands, not because the Vanderbilts were wiser than other families, but because one generation finally chose pragmatism over pride. George built a monument to beauty. William built a business. Only the business survived. The mansion welcomes over 1 million visitors each year, each one paying to see what unchecked wealth created and what disciplined work preserved. It's America's largest private home and its most expensive lesson. Fortunes built without structure collapse within generations. Legacy requires more than inheritance. It demands the one thing the Commodore's grandchildren refused to give: effort. Biltmore endures not as a Vanderbilt palace, but as a Cecil enterprise. The name on the deed changed because the family learned what the Commodore never taught. Wealth is not permanent, but work can be. If this rise, fall, and resurrection of America's greatest mansion left you stunned, hit that like button. Subscribe for more shocking stories of dynasties that built empires only to watch them crumble, and the rare few who managed to save what was left. Because the Vanderbilts weren't alone in their mistakes, and their story isn't over yet.